Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's DDN session at the HRI Constellations event. And I'd like to thank HRI for having us here. Today's session, more to join us than to divide us, about breaking down sort of barriers between harm reduction organisations and recovery groups, and how the world's a better place if we all work together. I thought we've got three great speakers on today, but I'm Ian. I'm from Drink and Drugs News magazine. I'm chairing the session today. So I thought it might be useful just to tell you a quick bit about us and sort of set the scene. We're DDN magazine. We're a UK publication. It's a magazine. You can subscribe to a print copy, like the one I just held up, but you can also subscribe and to an online version of it. Publishing is a free magazine for 17. And I think maybe it's helpful to say that we're myself and my colleague Claire Brown, who set it up from a publishing background. We previously published public health titles, environmental health titles. So we, from a particular treatment background, we weren't from the harm reduction community or the recovery community. We're, as I say, we're used to publishing journals and magazines. And so we tried to make it, and we still try and make it, an open platform that lets everybody, have a voice, and we hope it's inclusive. So I mean, today the session, so I thought maybe a bit of background would be useful. So recovery, where did it all start? Obviously the term's been around for a long time. I mean, obviously you've got Alcoholics Anonymous and all the other groups and colleges that have used the term, but Mike Ashton here, is a well-respected researcher, was saying that the sort of new term has been at the heart of British drug policy since 2008. As he says, it's been used as an inspirational call to overcome addiction and a justification also for limiting treatment. So it's got a long history, as I said, but the modern recovery era in Britain we dated back to 2008, when it was presented as a new dawn. And in 2008 it fitted with it. It was seen as very sort of attractive, and it is very attractive. It's very aspirational. As with anything new, I guess there were issues, and there was turbulence. When you get anything that sort of challenges the status quo, you're going to get that. And this is Grace Ball, who was the Recovery Academy director. I'll quickly read the quote. These are turbulent times in the addiction field. Ill-conceived government initiatives, outspoken comments from some recovery advocates, leaving many in mainstream addiction treatment feeling resentful and even distrustful of the new recovery agenda. Not only that, but there's been disputes and arguments within the recovery movement itself, which has led to frustration and confusion across professional groups and people trying to achieve the bridge between active addiction and active recovery. And I think that was there were problems, as I say, as you get with anything new. The recovery sector was, sort of challenging and saying maybe that mainstream treatment isn't aspirational enough. Mainstream treatment perhaps pushing back and saying where's the evidence base for this, and also making it important that it's inclusive and that people's recovery is a very personal thing, and not all people can go into this kind of model that was proposed at the time, where people would move through and then housing and jobs and this sort of bright kind of abstinence-based future, which wasn't achievable perhaps for some people, wasn't desirable for some people as well. So that I think takes time to sort of bed in, and the kind of personal nature of recovery. And, you know, again, this is a sort of quote that sort of shows back. This is sort of kicking back from the other side, you know, from harm reduction acts. You know, the recovery and narratives can sound conservative with both a big and a small c. Moral relativism is rare among people in long-term recovery. There are right and wrong ways of living. The right way is to get a job, to pay your rent, friends and family, and booze, benzos, and benefits, watching daytime TV. You know, as I say, it's at the time that it was seen as it was pushed by as a political agenda with Ian Duncan Smith, very much pushing this. This is the right way. And there was the language of people being parked on methadone, and you know, it was very divisive at the time. And we saw this because, as well as the magazine, we run the national conference, the DD National Conference, and this brings together around about 600 odd people from, well, they're not all odd, some of them are, and they're treatment professionals, they're people in recovery, they're harm reduction activists, people that use drug services, people that are still actively using drugs. And it's like the magazine, an open forum. We try and represent all views. So we'll have people talking about abstinence-based recovery on the same platform as someone who's talking about, you know, legalization or safer injecting spaces. So it's something for everyone. And we really noticed during this period there was a divide. You know, we noticed it. You know, sometimes there was an atmosphere within the conference hall, and as I say, we would sort of see ourselves as observers, and we would see that there was, as I say, a definite divide between people that saw themselves as advocates and activists, and people saw within the recovery community. This started to change, and within the conference, we noticed that change, and I mean, it's brought about by obviously a very bad thing, which is the rise in drug-related deaths. But we noticed a real change at the conference where people sort of, you know, there is no point fighting ourselves. There's no point with this infighting and arguing about what defines recovery and whatever. We need to pull together because people are dying out there. It's as simple as that. And we, as I say, we noticed the change at our conference. People very much got behind naloxone, about distribution, about, you know, sort of saving lives. A slogan, a saying that people were using a lot or still do use is that there's no recovery in a coffin. Unless you keep people alive in the first place, then, you know, the recovery is just not possible, and you're not going to achieve this by fighting, you know, within the group. You need a united front and all working together. And as I say, that language has sort of changed, and it's changed from the top down as well. Sort of, and this is Paul Hayes, who at the time was chief executive of Collective Voice, which is the kind of umbrella group of the larger treatment providers. And he said the government's recognition that evidence-based treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services need to be at the heart of our collective response to drug misuse, and is very welcome. And this is, you know, is continued. It is coming down, you know, say sort of top down. It is embedded within Carol Black's review, where you can see the bit in bold there. A new definition of recovery that is not limited to abstinence, but recognizes other measures of success. And as I say, from being an observer, publishing the magazine, we really noticed the change. We attend a lot of conferences and events, and we see now, you know, people will sit there with, you know, harm reduction, recovery, that those kind of terms, those labels, you know, sort of no longer seem relevant. Everyone is very much united about keeping people alive, and then, you know, the personal nature of recovery and you know, improving people's lives. And then I've got this quote, which is, you know, from a year or two ago, an article by Professor David Best, Professor Charlotte Coleman, and Stuart Green, who's speaking on this session. You can see the quote there, and you can sort of take time to read the quote. But the bit I picked out in bold really is that it's about acceptance. Recovery, you know, it's a personal thing. It's about acceptance. It's acceptance by family and friends, and a range of organisations and professionals across the community. So I hope that helps. I hope that helps to sort of set the scene. And rather than, you know, as I say, we're magazine publishers, we're sort of observing this, but I'll, you know, let 3 people speak now who are actually sort of involved in doing this and making it happen. And the first person is Vicky Beer. Vicky is Chief Executive of Project 6, who are an award-winning voluntary sector drug and alcohol charity, work across Yorkshire. And what's interesting, they describe themselves right front and centre of their website as a harm reduction and recovery focused service. Project 6 works associated with substance use and offers evidence to drug and alcohol use and their families. So I'll pass you over to Vicky now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. Thanks. That was really useful context of scene setting. So I'm just going to share my slides. Can somebody give me yeah, I can see that there, Brill. So as Ian said, we're a medium-sized charity. We work with people affected by, I don't like using drug and alcohol because for me it's like oranges and fruit, but I tend to use it for, you know, ease of conversation. So we work with people affected by drug and alcohol use and who experience other disadvantages. We used to term that as complex needs, but actually people don't have any more complex needs. We just build more barriers in the way of people and those needs. We all have similar needs. So we term it now about people experiencing multiple disadvantages. We're genuinely very values-led. We're led by me. I'm an unapologetic left field and passionate harm reductionist, but I also love recovery. I think both of them are extraordinarily important to people affected by drug and alcohol use. We're an amalgamation of 3 charities, all of whom have got a 35, 40-year experience of working in our 3 areas, which are Doncaster, Sheffield, Keighley and Bradford. All of those charities came up quite badly in the commissioning world, and we found it quite difficult to exist in a world of outcome-based competitive tendering, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So we've come together because we think there's strength in numbers and we can do some great stuff across all of the areas that we work in. And like I said, we're rooted in harm reduction, but we love recovery as well. So we like stories at Project 6. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about a member of our staff who's called Ingrid. Ingrid is somebody who used our services, our needle exchange, for years. She was in and out of the needle exchange, in and out of prison, in and out of involvement with social care. She ended up street drinking. Her behaviour could be really, really challenging. She was somebody that a lot of people would cross the street to avoid. We held her for many, many years in our needle exchange. She had a safe space where she could engage at her pace, where she wasn't judged, where it was okay that she used drugs. We don't condemn, we don't condone. And very, very slowly, we provided this really good safety net for her. Planted little seeds of possibilities that life didn't have to be this way. And we waited until we heard those words that all drugs workers will know when somebody says, I can't take this anymore. I want to do something different. So at that time, your opportunity is, okay, let's wrap around Ingrid. Let's see what Ingrid needs. Let's see where she wants to go to and how we can walk alongside to get her there. She says that harm reduction saved her life because it provided that opportunity to step away from that life into one with different possibilities. We had several attempts at her coming in and out of psychosocial interventions and prescribing. And actually, in the end, it was a community hepatitis C pilot that hooked her in because she knew she needed to do something different to protect her physical health as well. So we provided Ingrid with lots and lots of proper psychosocial interventions, evidence-based psycho interventions, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioural therapy, lots and lots of support. And she did absolutely brilliantly well. She came into our recovery services and she was just brilliant. She's such a character. She provided real light to others. She really was able to sense her role in helping other folk move through the treatment system and move into recovery, and how she could provide other people with that support. She applied for a job for it with us initially as a cleaner. She'd done the cleaning in a previous life, and she was one of the best cleaners that we ever had. But then she identified that she wanted a little bit more. She wanted to do something a bit different. So we supported her with volunteering, with MVQ, with harm reduction qualifications, and she's now our needle exchange worker. So she's come full circle. She's back in the place that helped her make those changes in the first place. She's absolutely brilliant. But harm reduction didn't save Ingrid, and recovery didn't save Ingrid. Psychosocial interventions didn't save Ingrid. Ingrid saved herself. Ingrid did all of this herself. But what she needed was the right services in the right place at the right time. And that's what I think drug and alcohol services in the sector has a responsibility to provide. 33% of our staff have lived experience of substances. More will have experience of domestic and sexual violence, of challenges with mental health as well. Probably more, 50-60% of the people that work for us have got some lived experience at some level. And I think as a sector, it's extremely important that we provide support for people to work in this sector. For example, a lot of our finance and admin team do as well. So it's not just folk in the front line. But we need to do it properly. We need to do it well. We need to make sure that people are supported. And that's something that we're really committed to at Project 6. So Ian asked us to think about what were the challenges and the blockages about getting harm reduction and recovery closer together? What was happening to the sector? So I thought about that, and I reframed it a little bit and started, when we're talking about trauma, we try and say, well, what has happened to us? What's not wrong with us? And Ian really helpfully started to set the scene for what I'm going to call the government policy change, which was started with get them in, keep them in, get them out, keep them out. Or 10 years of neoliberal crap, basically, which has been my experience of them. So in 2010, we had the new drug strategy from the coalition government. This is when recovery had been hinted at in the 2008 strategy, but it became front and centre of the 2010 drug strategy. There was a big push on recovery. Folk felt, as Ian was saying, that it was covert abstentionism, but there was very little focus on harm reduction services as well. So that set us off on a slightly different path. Then we had the Health and Social Care Act in 2012, which led us down the road of competitive tendering. Directors of public health began to be mandated to start to re-tender. Systems, competition was thought to be useful. I would sit in meetings where commissioners would say, well, the market will sort it out. And I would sit there thinking, the market will make it worse. This is not the way to deal with vulnerable people. And this was the start of the damage to the ecosystem of our sector. Alongside that, we had the growth of personal responsibility, a bit more neoliberalism. And I read in a drug policy document the other day when I was doing some research, there's actually a sentence that says they wanted people to become a gain, not a drain. And then we started with the mandatory attendance at drug and alcohol services around benefits as well. So there started to be, alongside that personal responsibility, it was that scroungers shirkers narrative was really, really being pushed as well. Alongside that, we have austerity. We have cuts to budgets. I think Susie Roscoe said there were 27% cuts to our budgets across the board. I know in one of the areas where I work, it's 60%. And we don't just have cuts to them, we then have reducing budgets. So every year your budget gets less and less while the need of people gets more and more. There's nothing more damaging for a drug or alcohol treatment system to know that the need's getting higher and higher and the money to do anything about it is getting less and less. And then we lost the ring fencing as well. So that's 3 pretty significant things to happen at once. The next step was the new managerialism approach. So the development of outcome frameworks, outcome-based commissioning as well. The idea that by producing a framework and an outcome, that we could care effectively for some of the most vulnerable, stigmatized, marginalized people in the country is insanity in my mind, honestly. We have the people that walk through our door at Project 6, they cannot have gone to school since they were 10. We have social workers, we have teachers, we have doctors, we have bus drivers, we have people that work in factories, we have people from every single walk of life. And the idea that you can mandate people's treatment with with a public health outcome framework is bonkers, quite frankly. And the consequence of this was with reduced budgets, was with reduced ring fencing, was that the providers often had to move their staff into the positions where they would get their key performance indicators. So what happened was everything moved into the middle, and we lost a load of our good harm reduction and recovery services. There's some great stuff bubbling up now, but we lost a lot of those specialist services. We lost a lot of expertise, and we lost a lot of passion from our sector. In our tender in Keighley, within about 2 or 3 weeks of a large national coming in, 20 staff had been tupied over. They all went. We lost something like 200 years of experience in a few weeks, and that has really, really damaged our sector, which brings me on to one of the final points, is about retendering. Nearly almost all areas now have a large single provider. As commissioners want to make sure that price is really important in tendering. So we've really become our architects of our own race to the bottom as well. So where are we now? Well, our biggest fan, Dame Carol Black, says we're not fit for purpose. And I genuinely hope we are at rock bottom, and I genuinely hope there is hope around the corner, because we have a really badly damaged ecosystem in drug and alcohol services. Like I said, we've lost those small, community-rooted, passionate organisations that aren't afraid to put their head above the parapet and aren't afraid to challenge and aren't able to speak with people's, multiple voices. We've got a system that focuses on hitting the target but missing the point. Harm reduction services are rarely there anymore. I looked at the Black recommendations. Harm reduction's mentioned once, hidden away in one of the middle ones. There's 5 on criminal justice, there's 4 on employment, but harm reduction isn't threaded through that review at all. But the biggest damage, I think, is that we're at each other's throats about which is more important. So I asked Ingrid this morning, she's here working in a project, working with some of our street drinkers. I said, what do you think is more important? Why do you think this is harm reduction is more important than recovery, or vice versa? And she looked at me like I was totally bonkers. And she said, Vicky, why? We need both. Why would we not have both? Why would we not have something that supports some people where they are in their life here, and then gives people fantastic opportunities to do something different there? And she was baffled and she couldn't get it. And I think she's absolutely right. So we believe that the hope can be provided by some of this. I want to see harm reduction services back, staffed by passionate staff who believe that drug taking is all right and understand the psychopharmacology so they can work with people. We have something called Bony Bob in our needle exchange, so we can explain to people, if you inject here, your hit will take this amount of seconds to get to your brain. If you inject here, it will take 6 seconds. But here's the risk with the 1 second. Here's the risk with the 6. Are those 5 seconds worth that extra risk? And we help people make informed decision about their drug use and help try and keep them safe. Something that we don't very often talk about is, but we need to get back to proper psychosocial interventions. We need to get back to staff being really genuinely trained in motivational interviewing, CBT, in having proper kind of continuing professional development, because those sessions are what helps people change what goes on in their heads. And we've lost that. And actually nobody's talking about that. And then we need real recovery with embedded relapse prevention. So really good understanding of the principles of relapse prevention. We like to use active citizenship because that gets folk out and about doing something. out in the community. We call it paying it forward, because we don't believe people have to pay anything back. We don't believe they've done anything wrong, but we want to help people pay it forward. And we like to create communities where people can come in and learn to be in a community, because they might find it really hard to be in their community at home because they've been stigmatized and shamed. We had one guy who came in, and I was saying to him, how can we tell that we've made a difference to you in terms of your engagement with your community? And he said, this time last year, I was a topic of my neighbourhood watch group. Now I'm a member of it. They've asked me to join in. And that for him was such a huge, huge achievement. He felt accepted by his neighbours as well. So that's what we aim to achieve by active citizenship. We need to have a genuine understanding of trauma and stop building systems with things like single point of contact, so people can't get through on the phone, and where people are assessed by somebody and then assessed by somebody else and then in a group with someone else. That's not trauma-informed practice. We need to make sure people don't have to repeat their stories again and again and again. And you see a lot of organisations now talk about trauma, and actually they're not displaying trauma-informed practice. So we need to be able to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And most importantly, we need to have each other's backs. I think harm reduction is fantastic, but I think recovery is absolutely brilliant. So there is hope, but we need to support each other to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. That's fantastic. That was absolutely brilliant. You really summed it up. Someone who's, as you described yourself, rooted in harm reduction but loves recovery, which I thought was a really nice way of asking it. I've got loads of kind of questions that came from it, but I think what we're going to do is go through the presentations and then kind of all come back together and then hopefully have just a bit of a chat, because some of the stuff you were saying, you know, about the sort of change in attitude and the stigma, I thought was really interesting. So it'd be great to our two speakers. So thank you very much, and see you in a bit. Next up, we've got Stuart Green. Stuart is manager of Aspire Drug and Alcohol Service in Doncaster, partnership between NHS and ADS. He's written a lot in DDN. He is involved in running the recovery games, which is something quite exciting. It's made some great covers of DDN as well. Lots of colour and lots of activity, lots of excitement there. He's a key member of the College of Lived Experience Organisations, the CLEARO, and part of a strategic group alongside Collective Voice, APA, ADFAM, and ES. And he is going to talk about working with lived experience organisations.
Thank you, Ian. And yeah, I'd echo exactly what Vicky's kind of covered already. So I think there's a few bits I'd like to pick up on, and I think part of early harm reduction is challenging language and stigma. Unfortunately, in the UK, I think stigma exists. And I've heard many a debate around, well, we need to change the word from addiction to substance misuse disorder. Personally, I just think we need to take the stigma out of the word addiction and consider that it's a long-term health condition. I'm very fortunate that I was actually a patient of the service I now manage. I'm 20 years in recovery, but I recognise it as a spectrum. And what interested me, I was just reading the William White paper that was released on the 18th, and he talked about harm reduction as pre-recovery, and this binary concept, there's harm reduction and recovery. I was thinking, and I love analogies. So I was thinking it's a bit like, you know, if you learn to drive, you know, harm reduction is making safer and safer cars. Recovery is learning to drive the car. Both have an important part to play when you're out and about and driving. I think it's really, really important. It's great that people recognise that, and I think for me, you know, the word sector, for instance, sector implies there's other parts and facets of it. I echo what Vicky said. I think the canary in the cage of drug-related deaths is austerity. The defunding in the services, and I'm really fortunate as being part of the NHS that whilst I run 16 needle exchanges, I also hold the residential rehab budget, so I hold that spectrum. What I do find really fascinating in that is that for me, it's recovery oriented systems of care. And whilst people do have complex issues, I do have patients in the service that have been here multiple years. It's about workers being ambitious enough to see potential around people being able to recover. And is recovery a long-term goal? I believe that people's well-being is very personal to an individual, but it's also equally it needs to be ambitious. And I think we suffer in services sometimes with the clinical fallacy that if all we see is poorly people turning up with arms hanging off or needle stick marks and stuff in their arms, that we can get that concept that recovery isn't possible. So I think visible recovery is what needs to be sprinkled across often harm reduction services. And hearing Vicky's story about someone that's now working in the needle exchange just creates that recovery contagion, that potential that, you know, you don't have to continue harming yourself for the rest of your life. What is your long-term goal in terms of that? Clearly, it's human nature at times to use substances, drugs and alcohol. There's no moral debate around that. We've been doing it for a lot of years. But when we look at it, you know, I'm a great believer that, you know, drug and alcohol services should be funded properly and maybe even returned partially to central ring-fence funding. Some of what we're fortunate where I'm in Doncaster is we've you know, I manage an inpatient NHS detox unit. There is only 6 in the country. So when you look at where else for any other health condition could you go and receive treatment, you know, for drugs and alcohol, a lot of that has been de-invested in. And unfortunately, the client group we work with often aren't the vote winners. So I think there's a lot of context around that. From where we are at the minute, or where I am at the minute, is I've been involved with LEROs, which is Lived Experience Recovery Organisations, and we run the Lived Experience Recovery Organisations. We've got a group of around about 40 to 45 LEROs. What's interesting about LEROs are they're strength-based and asset-based, and it's recognising that individuals are experts on their own selves. And this partly is about how institutions try to institutionalise the word recovery, when actually it's a very personal experience to that individual. So, you know, when you're looking at it, LEROs, I think often in a community, how healthy a community isn't how big the services are, it's how many lived experience recovery organisations. Sometimes they're the best kept secrets. They're often very flat structures. They're usually led by charismatic individuals, and you know, and often find funding from areas that don't necessarily have mainstream funding, so that they're charity or fixed term monies and stuff. So they're not necessarily commissioned in the usual way. So part of what we're doing at the moment is that we're trying to work with both Collective Voice, the Addiction Provider Alliance, and the English Commissioning Group around recognising that to actually influence recovery orientated systems of care, it's really important that LEROs and the College of Lived Experience have a place at that table. It's not just about recovery. We have harm reduction services in there. When you look at some of the fantastic work the Hepatitis C Trust has done with peer navigators and peer mentors, that ability to connect people and bring people in and access stuff, I think is really, really important. When, in terms of where we are at the moment, we're hopefully waiting on the next 10-year drug strategy, which is out. And we are working at the moment with some of the recommendations from Dame Carol Black report and looking at both the language that's used. And I think, you know, the language, if you look at like what Ian said, before 2008, the word recovery never existed. I think part of recovery, and there was a lot of debate at the time about people being parked on treatment, but then at the same time those very people had jobs, houses, and were doing quite well on treatment. So when you looked at that, I think recovery was kind of a cheap way of getting people out of services. Saying that, I really believe that for service land, it's really important that people have the opportunity to you know, look at their goals and strive towards a life without services where possible. Some people have got very complex conditions, and Vicky touched on the word trauma. And trauma informed is a really interesting area, because it is recognised clearly that, not everyone that's got an addiction issue has suffered from trauma, but there is a clear prevalence of adverse childhood experiences where trauma is featured in people. And often that's where the people we seem to be working with that get stuck in that kind of harm reduction and addiction stuff as well, and creating those gaps. So where we are at the moment with lived experience recovery organisations, we're looking, it's free to join the membership of that. We're meeting members monthly. We've got a steering group at the minute with Ed Day, who's the recovery champion, David Best, and we've got representations from Scotland, Wales and England in that steering group. But equally, we've got 40 to 45 Leros now join that group. What's interesting about those Leros is there's a lot of synergy around that, and where we are at the minute, we're looking at how we set some standards. Now, the important thing about standards on Leros is they don't need to be a cage. We want that to be scaffolding to support Leros. So what we've done is we've adopted the CHIME model, which comes from the mental health field. And I think sometimes recovery has been adopted from the mental health field. That word recovery was very much around recovery colleges and some of the stuff that Professor Mike Slade did. So the CHIME stuff really, really works well. And when you're looking at good harm reduction, having good connections, good hope, good identity, meaning, and empowerment, they all feature in harm reduction in a way, as well as recovery. So I think it's a synergy and very much a spectrum across them both. So we're developing the standards. The standards that are being developed by the Leros themselves. We're already seeing some really positive early results around Leros being able to get part of funding. Recent Lero in New York has succeeded in getting over £40,000 worth of funding. So we're there to promote Leros and enable them to have a voice at the table, but equally also a part of the mainstream funding where possible. And increasingly, we're kind of lobbying for that and parity of esteem with both lived experience recovery organisations as well as traditional commissioned services. I think the beauty of Leros for me is when I look at the service I manage, it's very easy to industrialise or institutionalise an aftercare service, and then an aftercare service, and then an aftercare service where people just go and drink cups of tea and eventually, they meet other lonely people. But the point with Leros is actually people get treated in hospitals and stay well in communities. So Leros are often really embedded in those communities and bring the local assets, and it gives purpose and meaning for people to come to them. Historically, they're very much their mainstream is people with lived experience work in those organisations. It's a conduit to support people. It's visible recovery, saying that it is possible, and equally from a harm reduction point, that they are often used across harm reduction services to provide naloxone and stuff like that. So I think there's a part to play in both. I find the whole debate around harm reduction or recovery, it's a spectrum, is what I would say. In terms of Lero membership, if you want to give Ian a shout, please do. Or anything else about Leros, we're more than happy to come and talk to you about it. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Stuart. That was interesting. I mean, we've been coming along to the meetings of the CLERO, the College of Lived Experience. We as a magazine have been, involved in right back to the magazine, but the conference in particular. Lots of lived experience organisations and lots of the people that your members. Fairly obvious reasons. Last 18 months, but we're hopefully COVID allowing, we're planning on all being back in spring next year, and hopefully you and the different organizations as part of the college will be a big part of the event. As I say, I've got a load of questions, but as I say, we'll all come together at the end and run through those. So thank you very much. Next speaker is Anne-Marie Ward. I've known Anne-Marie for a long time. She's spoken at the DDN conference that I keep shamelessly plugging. and she's written for the magazine. Anne-Marie's a person in recovery. She's chief executive of Favour UK, a UK-wide based charity led by people with living and lived experience of alcohol and other drugs, and representing the voices of communities affected by addiction. They organised a recovery walk, which brings people celebrating recovery and in venues around. In addition, they have been running a really hard-hitting campaign, You Keep Talking, We Keep Dying, which advocates for more action to tackle drug-related deaths. And also very, very importantly, and potentially, I imagine, game-changing, and Anne-Marie will explain this, lobbying for the Right to Recovery Bill in the Scottish Parliament, within a right to treatment within the law. But I'll hand you over to Anne-Marie.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks very much, Ian, and thank you to our speakers that have went before me. I thoroughly enjoyed not just your introduction and the brief synopsis that we did there, and looking back at the history of how we got to where we are. And I was just thinking it's probably time we did that in a big way. So I'd love to see DN and Favour UK and anybody else who would be interested in doing some sort of summit and reflection of the last 12 years, because I think the comment that Vicky made about the neoliberal crap summed it up perfectly. And for us, it was always a really difficult balancing act between the recovery agenda, which was very politically driven, and being leaders within the recovery movement. And I think it was very difficult for many people, both in the harm reduction field and the recovery community, to separate the agenda from the movement. And I think maybe now we've got a wee bit of perspective around what's actually happened and why that fledgling and embryonic, unity that we saw in the early years, that was potentially really exciting and pioneering, and it was genuinely a new paradigm. It was a paradigm shift in how the policies and the agenda, the recovery agenda, and the difficulties that the commissioning process and the removal of the ring fence Munden money. And for me, one of the big significant things for me that happened was we had this, what I had hoped would become a price fixing cartel, collective voice, which was made up of the big charities in the third sector. And I thought, here's a real opportunity for them to price fix, and that wasn't what happened. And in fact, we saw one of the national providers go bust because they were cutting each other's throats to the point where, like Dame Carol Black and Vicky said there, our services are no longer fit for purpose. And that exodus of not just professional experience but hope that left the field during those years, until we're now in a very basic situation where we are putting, for the most part, the £600 million budget goes on the very basics of harm reduction interventions, and we saw not just a complete annihilation of abstinence or recovery focused services, but we saw the rhetoric of that policy and just the whole political ramping up of language being used. And I believe we are now more entrenched now in those very human camps of harm reduction versus recovery. I've seen a sort of return to entrenchment, in particular in the last couple of years. And I think that's as a result of everything that Vicky laid out for us around, those neoliberal policies. I think there's hope, and Stuart very eloquently spoke about that with the development of the frameworks and the scaffolding that Leros are trying to build, and there is hope within all of that, and there's also, very importantly, and we like to think that we bring this as well, the service user voice. We're a UK-wide recovery organisation. We have over 5,500 members who, when they sign up, they describe themselves as someone in recovery. We don't ask them which path. We don't ask them if they're abstinent. We don't ask them if they're in medically assisted recovery. We're not interested, quite frankly. That's none of our business. If you want to identify and use that word, the recovery word, that's entirely up to you. And I think one of the major problems that we are facing, and that we've always faced, is that because, these entrenched camps of either or are very human. It's a very human thing to do. Like, you're either Celtic or Rangers if you're in Glasgow, or, male, female, Catholic, Protestant, black, white, gay, straight. This is a very human failing, I suppose, to become tribal, or to become fixed or wedded to one particular philosophy. But the great thing about both harm reduction and recovery is that they have tremendous principles that everybody can align under, if only they could see what I would, the similarities rather than the differences. I wanted to highlight today I suppose it's one of the best sort of pieces of research that I've seen for ages, and it was a piece by Jo Neal, and I think they entitled it, I'm not quite sure the exact title, but if I remember correctly, it was something along the lines of, "You're all going to hate the word recovery." And I'll make a point about just the word, the Right to Recovery Bill that we wrote as people in recovery. It's our bill. We wrote it in conjunction with other friends, some of us who are still, who wouldn't describe ourselves as being in abstinent-based recovery, but we are in medically assisted recovery. Some of us wouldn't even describe ourselves as being in recovery, and that's okay. And when we originally wrote the bill, we called it the Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment Bill. And language, as other people have pointed out, is incredibly important. And the phrase alcohol and other drug treatment reminds us all, of our collective denial around alcohol being a drug. And not only just the moral sort of connotations that the right use to degenerate and insult and stigmatise drug users, whilst they're drinking their Beaujolais and their Chardonnay. So yeah, language is incredibly important. And as I said, when we wrote the Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment Bill, we presented it to the great and the good and the work behind it, which was based on legal counsel. We sought legal counsel from the highest senior counsel in the land here in Scotland. And although we are a UK-wide charity, obviously COVID has, in some respects, narrowed our focus, in particular because the drug deaths are incredibly high, but also because we were grounded for quite some time, so our focus naturally fell. And also my own personal experience, whereby this year I've been to 3 funerals of close friends who have died, which has been absolutely horrendous. I can't tell you the impact that's had on me personally. And that's absolutely as a result of, Scotland being in the grip of this national pandemic of drug deaths. So, yeah, the word recovery, as I said, when we started to seek legal counsel in this area, we were told very much that what we had done up until that point, which was focused on monthly events, organising monthly events where it was really, really disheartening to see that sometimes as many as 700-800 people were turning up at these events, but none of the so-called government-funded NGOs were coming, but it was all friends and family. And then even when these events were being reported on national television and radio on a regular basis, because we held them monthly, we were still seen as, you know, troublemakers, and we were actually called trolls, trolls and menaces. But luckily what happened was that the press really got behind us, and we fed them stories of three things in particular. We fed them stories of hope, and we fed them stories of love, and we fed them stories of loss. And that really captured the press's imagination, and they got right behind us. We also invited local politicians, local councillors, both members of the Scottish Parliament and members of the English Parliament or the British Parliament, the UK Parliament. Get my political affiliations there with that language. So, yeah, I mean, as a result of hosting those monthly events, we more or less pressured the Scottish Government into delivering £225 million over the course of the next 5 years, or certainly a promise of it anyway. And that was a result of a mounting and continued pressure from our press campaign that we have developed and built on, and which led us to the Right to Recovery Bill, as it's now known. So the political manifestations of that. So we, as I said, took the information and the work that we did to get it to the point, to the great and the good of the Scottish addiction field, primarily because we're such a small organisation. We don't have statutory funding. We raise every penny by ourselves. And quite frankly, I'm exhausted, and I thought, I cannot take this forward. There's much bigger organisations. I was going to say better, but I'll stop myself there. There's much bigger, more resourced organisations than us that could take this forward, and we presented it to them. We presented it to all of them, and they told us, we'll call you, don't call us. Which, you know, again, you know, when you're challenging the status quo, there's a lot to protect, and that's essentially what we've been doing for the last 2 years, and ranks have closed in certain areas. But where we are now is the Tories in Scotland, who are the main opposition, have tabled the bill. And it's sometimes, you know, the press very annoyingly refer to the bill as the Right to Recovery Bill. But you know, it's still, and going back to the Joe Neal's research about, you're all going to hate the word recovery. What we've found is that some of our strongest allies in the harm reduction world will not even read it because that word is in the title. But let me just, and I would ask you if you are interested, it's potentially the most useful piece of work that, if implemented, would see a massive investment. In fact, it would bring the investment that Dame Carol Black has recommended. If we pass this bill in Scotland, it would only be a matter of time, and we're already working with MPs in England and Wales to bring it into something that's palatable down south. But going back to the word recovery and the Joe Neal researchers, what did they do? The researchers ran 5 focus groups in 2 English cities with clients who use drugs, clients who drink, service users in detox, residential rehab, people also who described themselves as ex-drug or alcohol users. The numbers were small, there was 44, but it was qualitative research. So they were looking for nuances and themes and meaning. And what did they find? So basically in the research, they found that expecting the impossible, that service users felt that service providers expected more of them than was reasonable. You know, and when we look at the principles and the concepts of recovery, there's a very strong asset of and mantra of progress, not perfection, you know, so that we don't find that in the recovery world, but we see those expectations and unreasonable requests being forced on people and services. We saw that in the research, we saw that outcomes that don't capture the effort that is involved to not only initiate a recovery journey, but to sustain it is incredibly difficult. Most people don't make it, as we know. It's a chronic relapsing condition. And our services are not geared up to support that and to walk with people on their journeys across their lifetime. The dangers of progress, i.e. that, you know, we can get really cocky and that we can turn that progress into complacency, and the hidden benefits of negative outcomes, so affective in states, in particular in early recovery, as indicators of change. And you know, like tiredness, I certainly know that for most people in the first year, maybe 2 years of recovery, there's a tremendous tiredness. There's a massive grief process that happens. There's a lot of grieving, and the work around that is unknown. There's so much about recovery actually that's unknown, because so often our research focuses on pharmaceuticals. But failure to recognise individual differences and programmes being too generic in service land is one of the major problems that we see, and that the research highlights. Not only that there's a lack of evaluation on you know, all of the different recovery paths, but there's also a lack of monitoring and real world data around what is it that helps us get and stay well. So you know, for us, there's much to be celebrated. You know, we believe that there are many pathways to recovery if someone chooses recovery, and that all of those paths are worthy of celebration, and that our beliefs as professionals actually don't matter. Our job is to make sure that people get access to all the paths that will help them, regardless of what that means, and not to punish people for one particular path not working for them. I think the problem of beliefs in our field is one that divides us, but the principles of both harm reduction and the principles of recovery is what can unite us. After all, we've got into this situation whereby we are just, and this is very much the focus now because of the cuts. We are so focused across, and of course I'm speaking generally, but in many of our services across the UK, we are so focused on just, and I use that word, just keeping people alive. And there's so much more on offer. For everyone, it's not necessarily a linear journey. And there will be periods where, you know, certainly even in my own abstinence-based recovery of almost 24 years now, I have got stuck in many retrogressive grooves in my own development and my own growth. And just even, you know, as a human being, none of us are perfect, and there is much to learn and love about each other. And I think if we bring it back to those principles that, you know, both the harm reduction field and the recovery field subscribe to, that if we focused on that a lot more, we would make far more progress, even despite the horrendous re-entrenchment, I think, that we've seen over the last few years because of the necessary fighting to get access to funds. Can I just say that the recovery movement has never been funded in the UK? I speak to colleagues regularly across the world who run Favour in Brazil, in Spain, Canada, Australia, America, South Africa, and the UK is still the only place where we have a Faces and Voices of Recovery that doesn't have any statutory funding. And you know what? Maybe that's just as well, because it gives us an autonomy and an integrity that I think we don't have to play anyone's tune. Apart from, of course, our loyalty will always remain with the people who are recovering and also the people who are suffering from addiction. And as long as our loyalty remains there, rather than to treatment institutions or philosophies or ideologies, I think certainly Favour UK will continue to flourish. We're always open to growth and critique. And we have one of the big failings for us is that we have never been able to attract a board member who is in medically assisted recovery, and we have approached many. So if you are someone who considers yourself in recovery and is on, whatever medication, or even, in the traditional sense of the word recovery, if you consider yourself in recovery, please get in touch. We would love to have wider representation on our board, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Anne-Marie. That was brilliant. And I know obviously it's something sort of very personal to you, as you say. When I spoke to you, when I phoned you, I think to ask you if you'd be involved in this session, you'd just heard of that you'd lost another friend that day. So I mean, that really brings it home. That you're not talking about numbers of drug-related deaths. You're talking about people and families. So thank you very much. If I invite the other speakers back on, I think there's a few kind of questions popping back in the chat. And a few things go. I mean, I sort of made a lot of notes, and I maybe sort of jump in first because it was something that Vicky said, and I think Stuart sort of said as well that and Anne-Marie said it. I mean, everyone has said it. The funding, there's been a massive loss of local organisations, and with that, obviously, a loss of experience. With the big providers coming in, you're not getting the local funding. Is this now an opportunity, or maybe a kind of sort of movement for the Leros to step into that space? And if so, what support do they need to do that in terms of funding, training, etc.? I don't know.
There's two things. I mean, for me, the analogy, and I'm great with analogies, is if you break your leg, you want a doctor to mend it, but you want maybe someone that's previously had a broken leg to help you with recovery. So I think there's a role to play for both. And there's absolute room in the whole thing. What you don't want is that using resources in that way to support people. And actually, people lived experience that there's no better intervention. All the PSI in the world, the best thing you can do for people is give them a new group. I think with some of the skills is like social identity mapping. When you look at people's networks, that's what needs to happen. And it's that peer support. I mean, I run a service, and I claim I'm client-centered. I'm not. People walk into my waiting room and sit down. That isn't client-centered. That's system-centered. Person-centered services often are Leros, are often there. They're there 24/7. They don't stop at the weekend. And there's a different passion in there. With the best will in the world, the other bit that's really frustrating at the minute is that partly the squeeze on budgets is actually I've lost staff because basically they can earn more in Amazon, and we're paying staff to work with highly vulnerable people, and they can earn the same sort of money, and that worries me. So when we're looking at an investment, we need to recognise that people are paid to be working with quite often quite complex people, and then we'll get some retention back in the workforce. So, and caseloads as well. I mean, there's no national benchmarking around caseloads. So when you look at it, often caseloads are worked out buy, well, how many key workers can we buy, and then we'll divide the numbers in treatment or the health needs assessment, and then place them with that worker. And then we're expecting people to work effectively with caseloads of 60, 70 upwards. The first reference I've seen recently is in the Dame Carol Black report around caseloads around 40, 45, which is really good news, because it's starting to say that we've actually got time to work with people and make some meaningful change. Because meaningful change isn't going to happen once a fortnight in a 1 hour key working session. We might be able to nudge someone, but realistically, it's about what they're doing in between that. So I think, yes, there's a real opportunity with Leros. And I think the beauty about the Leros space is every person in recovery or every person in that community, it becomes bigger. And I think David encapsulates it. The difference between economic capital and recovery capital is when you spend money, you have less of it. When you spend recovery capital, you have more of it at the end of it. So I think there's a real investment in how we work with that. The issue is, and if you've never watched that video, Blobs and Squares, watch it. The problem with a lot of the commissioning stuff, and what Anne-Marie was alluding to, is that people want to see how the public purse is spent. And sometimes with Leros, they're very grassrooted. They're not necessarily based on labels or a death map. They're based on the fact it's about strength-based and how people do well and connect. So I think there's a part to play for both, Ian.
Great. I mean, have you got anything to add, Vicky? Because obviously it was you that first brought it up.
I think just stepping back another step, there is no ecosystem in the world that survives with one large provider. One large thing is that we need that rich ecosystem. We need people that are passionate, and organisations that are passionate about harm reduction, that are passionate about recovery, that give people's voices, that drive the trauma-informed response. We need all of that. We need a system. And actually, in some places, we don't have a system. And that's not healthy, because you need to bring challenge. You need to make sure that we're working with a really, really enormous range of folk as well. And also people need choices and options. If you go to a city where there's one choice and you have a poor experience there, you have no other choice, and that's not okay. So yes, there's absolutely a real need to bring back some of the small, medium organisations. Lero's brilliant, other organisations brilliant, that can create that really flourishing ecosystem, Ian.
Do you think that's something that can be driven by commissioners, putting it within contracts? I mean, I know there's big organisations come in and they say we work in partnership with X, Y, and Z on the ground, but do you think having that really entrenched in contracts would make a difference?
I think there's a couple of ways you could do it. So there are some areas that have a keep it local focus. So Bradford is one, Bristol is one, where the local authorities are working to work out how they can support their local providers. So they're Project Sixes that have been there for 40 years. So if we can drive commissioners to understand about the value of genuinely understand the value of localism and social value, not just a tick box exercise on a tender where everybody writes the same answer, but really social value, localism, and maybe there's something about ring fencing some of those budgets as well. Because what happens is smaller organisations like ours often go into partnerships, and then your budget is cut, and then it's cut again. Sometimes people are cut out after year 2. So there's challenges in that subcontracting arrangement. But also sometimes the value of us smaller organisations is that we can challenge and hold to account. And you've got to be really brave to do that if you're challenging the hand that feeds you as well. So the system needs to take account of that. But in my perspective, I'm thinking, is it the right thing to do? I want to run a service where my mum could come and walk through the door and get a brilliant service. And if that means that I'm a bit of a pain in the ass and I have to rattle some cages, then I'll do it, because it's the right thing to do. But it's quite difficult sometimes.
Someone who's not afraid to rattle a few cages, Anne-Marie, have you got anything to add to that?
Not really. I mean, the guys have covered it all. I just think it's important that, even something as simple as the word recovery can, we're in a situation now where that word just, people have contempt prior investigation. They won't even look past it because it's so tainted with the recovery agenda, which is obviously political and connected to the massive disinvestment. And Vicky was quite right. In some places, it's as much as 70%. Which is horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous, and I'm just struck by, how the last few years I've just witnessed this massive re-entrenchment. And I do believe a call to action. So, even being asked to speak at this today, is an honour and a privilege, but it's also it could well develop into something else. We have to be seen to be unifying more. One of the things that struck me about this conference in particular, and I've managed to watch some of the presentations, was and I'm happy to be proved wrong on this. You had probably one of the most visible recovery advocates in the world open this conference, i.e. Elton John. But there was nothing in the communication, and the communications about what he said were absolutely brilliant, related to the harm reduction principles. And brilliant harm reduction interventions and harm reduction services, and we need more investment in them. We absolutely do, right across the UK. We definitely do. But there's nothing even in those communications about Elton John's recovery status, as a person in extremely long-term recovery. So I think if we can be mindful of, it's not that difficult to understand that. And in fact, I was thinking about this last month. There isn't a word for someone like me or Vicky or Stuart who believes in, harm reduction with all their heart, but is also, a person in recovery or believes in the hope of recovery. If we had a word that could describe who we are, I don't know what it would be. But even just the word, the concept of having that, so you're either a harm reductionist or you're a recovery person. I hate the term recoveryist. It's so awful. But if there was something that described us in between it, I think we could rally around that and get behind it. And just encourage and support each other to stay in that centre ground and the extremes of any society. And I think our community, as people who love people who are, harming themselves or who are in addiction, is made up with such a variety of different people. Even yesterday with another so-called recovery advocate, he was saying, yeah, but they don't have the illness of addiction. And I was like, well, no, everyone who comes to services is addicted. Not everyone who comes to services is dependent. So, there are many areas of, growth and exploration that are required. And I truly believe that we are embryonic in this field. We are at the very beginning of it, and history will judge us very harshly about how we treat people with addiction. So, I just think there's, more to unite us than divide us.
Ian, can I just say, the thing, going back to commissioning, I think we are seeing a bit of a paradigm shift. I think we are seeing, price versus quality. The quality is creeping up more as a percentage of tenders, which is really good news. We're also seeing longer tenders potentially going out, which is, again, is good news, because otherwise you're mobilising and kind of winding down or looking at, what's going to happen next. So we are seeing that happen. I think for Leros, for me, where it would be really exciting is when Leros have got that credibility around the standards being scaffolding rather than the cage. We don't want to combine it, but they are almost the audit or the equivalent of CQC for services. And actually, what does good and quality look like? Because there's a lot of use of the word, and I've seen it. Recovery care plan. It's nothing about recovery. It's just in its purest sense. It's about appointments. It's about attending. It's about going up and down on methadone, which is fine. It keeps people alive. Dead people don't recover, do they? So it's really important that it's in there. But equally, I think it's about, when you look at health needs assessment, it tends to be a deficit-based approach, and commissioning is based on the health inequalities, which is rightly so. But equally, we need to do some of the strength-based stuff to actually say how we're going to promote stuff. And Andy Ryan said it the other day, and he said, you know, the way the drug use within your community is your community communicating with you, which I thought was really interesting, which I thought was a really good analogy about how healthy that community is.
Yeah, and I think one of the main things that's coming out, certainly in Scotland, and I can hear rumblings of it being organised and mobilised in England, is that the lived experience voice is going to take, or living and lived, is going to take more of a centre stage. And I'm just hopeful that that also includes friends and family, and not just people, you know, who have suffered. One of the things that strikes me about Lero is, you know, it's so all encompassing, and like you said, there's a scaffold in there and there's a frame, you know, to build a frame. And we also have, as I'm sure you know, the Association of Recovery Community Organisations, which would be, if there was a frame, the ARCRO criteria would sit right at the top. That would be where Lero's would, you know, want or aspire to evolve to, if they believed in the concept of, you know, the Association of Recovery Community Organisations worldwide. The two main criteria for it are that over 50% of your board is in recovery or friend and family of recovery, and it's completely non-profit. So, you know, there is, and not to use top or bottom, you know, like I'm happy to have ARCRO at the bottom. It's not to say that, but it's a very ambitious aim, you know, to have organisations in the UK that would subscribe to calling themselves an ARCO as well. But one of the things that I think we've maybe missed today is, you know, the research that came out recently, in particular, highlighted in Scotland that you are 18 times more likely to die if you live in our poor communities from a drug death. So I can't underestimate or overemphasise, you know, the power of poverty and inequality, and that how that's getting played out, not just in the deprofessionalisation of our field, and the lack of investment in our field, but, you know, in our communities in general. And we believe that there are pioneers out there who are building community projects, traditional asset-based, old school community development projects that will serve people with addiction problems far better than our entrenched and at times, I mean, I've just received an email as we've been on from a boy who has been fighting to get into rehab for over a year, and he missed an appointment yesterday, and they have withdrew his place at his rehab place because he missed an appointment. Now, 20 years ago, when I first came into this field, I thought that was incredible that people were even being given appointments, like chaotic drug users were being given appointments. And it's something as simple as that, you know, like when we can't even respond to the person's needs wherever they are and meet them wherever they are, that we are constantly trying to get them to meet our needs as organisations and as services. That, you know, that's, if we can't even get the basics right 20 years on, what hope have we got? Sorry.
No, I mean, that absolutely, and that's very much what Vicky was saying earlier when she was talking about, you know, not condoning, and engaging with someone at their pace. It also kind of links in a question I noticed in the chat earlier on from Peter Yarwood, and obviously for all of you, but just really very briefly, he was asking very specifically about the rehab budget, and have you seen it increasing, decreasing in your areas?
For me, it's been a flat. Yeah, Doncaster would maybe shouldn't shout this. It's been very positive. We've not seen any disinvestment in rehab. Fortunately, it's, you know, it's triple ring fenced and can't use it for anything else, which is brilliant. So we've still got very much the same rehab budget we had. So we've never seen an increase, but I've never exhausted it, and I've never refused anyone to go to rehab. I do think community services have got a lot better now, So there's certainly a lot more landscape between harm reduction and rehab. I think there's a lot of other opportunities. During the pandemic, I haven't had the same requests to go to rehab, and I know rehabs have struggled with the isolation periods as well, because obviously when you land in rehab, you've got, you know, you want that peer group to support you, and actually you've got to isolate for 10 days, and you know, a day in abstinence, early abstinence is a major feat. So I think the challenges are very much there, and we've seen a number of rehabs close, haven't we, over this year?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I think you know, one of the fallacies that we see cropping up all the time is that somehow in the UK and in Scotland in particular since 2010 has had a treatment system focused on abstinence-based recovery, or like helping people get clean. And it's not hard to find politicians or commentators claiming that that's what we have, but actually the reality is what's funded and what's delivered on the ground. And the story of the last 12 years in all services is that they've been massively stretched, that the cuts have been massive at a time when drug problems were diversifying and deepening. And within that overall picture, it's the recovery abstinence services that have been most depleted. The vast majority of the £600 million spent by taxpayers on the treatment system is spent for the most part on OST, excellent, vital harm reduction interventions and one-to-one case management. And it's important to distinguish political rhetoric from reality. And we'll see a report published tomorrow, I think, from Phoenix Futures, which is going to highlight just how decimated the rehab places have been across England. I think it's England and Wales. We did a report about 6 months ago in Scotland that highlighted it. So yeah, although Stuart's saying in his area, no, it's flatlined, it is across the UK. It's massively disinvested in.
How about you, Vicky?
In one of the areas that we work with that went through a really significant retender a few years ago, the system hasn't sent anyone to rehab in 4 years because
Wow.
the process was hidden deep inside adult social care system, and it is unfathomable. And that's not for the lack of trying. It's appalling, you know. It's absolutely appalling.
No, I think, sorry, I'm really passionate about this. In Europe, we have a European average of 11% of all treatment episodes, so you know, end up in rehab. And I think this report being released tomorrow highlights it's 0.8% in the UK. It's not even 1%.
Yeah,
so
it's just not good enough.
And answer your question, Pete. Love you, mate. Yeah, the whole thing's been decimated totally.
Yeah. I totally agree. I just got a little thought, a bit challenged back about the Lero stuff. It's really important that we have that lived experience voice, but what we're not very good at in our sector is getting the voice of the people that don't access our services. So for me, there's another piece of work to do when we're talking about that ecosystem. It's talking to people that can't access services or fall out of them or get fed up when they've rung the spot 3 times. So that there's a group of folk out there that can't get in. And actually their voice, they're the ones I really want to hear from. Because I hear from my guys in recovery all the time. Whenever I walk through the building, they tell me what they're doing and what works and what doesn't work and what they're happy with and what they want more of and what they want less of. And it's brilliant. But what I'm not hearing from is the folk that don't get through the door. And I think we've got a job in our sector to find and to listen to that voice, even if it's really hard to hear.
Absolutely massive, Vicky, especially in Scotland. There's less than 40% of people, you know, actually, like 60% of people who should be in treatment are missing. They're just not even showing up, you know. And I think it's the opposite in England, isn't it? It's like 30 or 40% are missing and they're showing up. So, yeah. And it's not because they're hard to reach. You know, that's usually the rhetoric that's put forward. It's because services aren't attractive enough, you know. How can we make services more attractive?
I mean, the other bit, just to be clear about Leros as well, is there's people in Leros at natural recovery that have never touched service land because, you know, people do naturally recover. And I think, you know, that is one of the risks with Leros. They are fragile and vulnerable, is that they get institutionalized and manufactured within service land if you're not careful. And don't get me wrong, there's, you know, we have volunteers and mentors that obviously go through services and work as ambassadors within the services, but that isn't a Lero. So I suppose Leros are it's about giving them that space, isn't it? I echo what you're saying, because it's not for everyone. It's not a Pollyanna world, you know, Leros at times, and sometimes, you know, when you look at it, I mean, I was fortunate enough to visit Vicky's street drinking service last week. Amazing, you know, when you look at women that street drink, they street drink often because they've suffered domestic violence in a closed room. So she's created a space. It's an outdoor area with seating, which is familiar, where they can go and sit. So, you know, when you look at why people aren't engaging, we're offering them the wrong thing. If it was chocolate cake and you're offering them ginger biscuits, no wonder they're not engaging. You know, so that's your offer. So hard to reach is rubbish, because I know exactly where the people are in Doncaster. We've got either the wrong offer or it's out of reach.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And we just I've just been sort of, we're running a bit short on time, but just to jump in and say, we've been talking to someone about sort of piece of work that they're doing, where they're working with hard to reach groups and hard to reach communities, both in terms of, you know, sort of a drug and alcohol setting, but you know, sort of general, and they're working with sort of really kind of disenfranchised groups, and we're talking to them about an article that we'll be running in the magazine. It was a really quick question, because we haven't got long to talk about, and it kind of, you know, comes on from that. Do you think then it's important that Leros are independent, or do you think they work if they're embedded in a service? Do you think they need to be independent?
They need to be independent. They need to be independent. They need to find a way of the bridge between, and it's back to what Vicky's saying. It's the recovery and harm reduction ecosystem. It's about it's the sum, but it can't be harnessed. It can be supported. It can be seed funded. It can be match funded. Whatever way you want to tackle it. But ultimately, it needs to be given autonomy and not get lost in risk assessments or tight governance structures, because otherwise it'll just be institutionalized. So it needs that space to be created, and it needs to be visible as well. That's part of the key. But I think it is about independent. I mean, when you look at America, recovery support services are separately funded, that kind of stream. So I think there's something about whether it will come in the UK. There needs to be a conduit for them to access it. Interestingly, some of the commissioners that are in recovery, some of the areas they are commissioning, the way they've been innovative around Leros and that kind of remit has certainly been supportive.
I'm gonna have to stop you there. You're both nodding your head, so I'm guessing you're both agreeing that they kind of do need to be independent. Well, I just you say we've only got about a minute left, so I quickly kind of sort of wrap things up. I think for you know, giving us this space, and for putting on this event as well, which is kind of engaged with sort of a lot of people perhaps that we don't normally talk to. I want to thank all three of the speakers today. I think you've been fantastic. You've been really interesting, really engaging, very thought-provoking. Then you've always got to be closing. I mean, so I'm gonna plug DDN. I'm gonna say, look, there's a link there. Please subscribe. You get the email updates. We will be covering this. We'll be covering all the sessions, well, not all of them, but a lot of the sessions at this conference. So please subscribe. Make sure you get copies, and also, you know, the articles about a lot of the services we've talked about, and updates for the conference next year that we'll be holding, that we hope to see, well, all three of you and hope 597 other people as well. But thanks ever so much. Thanks to everyone that watched, and have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Great to see Lee and Carol. Hi, Carol. Hi, Lee. Good to see you guys. Well, not see you, but good to know you're here.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.